Reported by Neil Wallace as this week's newsmaker in Farmers Weekly. We are talking to one man that I think has got a fantastic status within our community. He is a wildfire specialist for Fire and Emergency New Zealand. And they are, of course, the first responders called out to fight our rural fires, often in remote and hostile areas. Their life revolves around weather forecasts, much to the same as our later guests, of course, Phil Duncan from Rural Weather. But I mean, in terms of making sure that they have what they need on the ground and being in a high state of readiness when those hot temperatures come through. A third of all rural fires, easily the most common cause, old fires that are not fully extinguished and reignited. Joined now by this week's newsmaker, Graeme Still, Dunedin-based Fire and Emergency New Zealand's national wildfire specialist. Hey, thank you so much for joining us, Graeme. I appreciate it. It's an extremely busy time of year with these hot temperatures. How has the last 12 months been in all of your career in the number of wildfires across New Zealand?
It's been quite variable, to be fair. Yeah, I wouldn't say I've had more fires in the last 12 months, Sarah, but we've had bigger fires. So that's been quite challenging. Yeah.
And when it comes to fighting bigger fires, at what point do you, in your capacity, coordinate with ground crew to pull out and go to the air?
It's case by case basis, Sarah. So yeah, first of all, we do what we call we have a bit of a look, and then we do it from there. We'll organise tactics and strategies and all those big words. So there is a point in time. So we basically, when the fire intensity gets too high to attack a fire directly, so what we'll use aircraft for what we call either an indirect attack or direct attack because it's too hot for the ground crews.
And let's talk through some of these fires. I mean, the latest, and quite a few in your area as well, in the Lemon Ranges off the back of Middlemarch. And of course, we all know about the Lake Pukaki fire destroying 5,000 hectares. Is there a few similarities in these types of fires and understanding their origin and how fast they spread, the learnings that we can take forward into other major fires of this nature?
Yeah, there are a few learnings, and that is that these fires occurred what we call outside the traditional fire season. So if we take Laminor 1, Deep Creek 1, that was sort of in late winter. And if we took Lake Ohau, that was sort of early spring. So what we're seeing is that the fire seasons are reasonably unpredictable. So our fuels are available to burn earlier, if you like, whereas our fuels were generally available to burn in the summer. Yep. So we're seeing that our fine fuels are drying out much faster earlier in the seasons. And so that's the sort of, if we could look at those two in particular, that's the sort of common denominator, that the fires occurred earlier rather in the late winter, early spring, and our fuels have dried out relatively quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, drier weather through the winter, as well as what potentially longer rank grass in some of these areas as well, with less stock grazing going on.
Yeah, there's a bit of that, and it's to do with the frost curing. So we're understanding what frost curing is. So if we take the Laminors 1, pre fire, we had a couple of weeks of what we call frost curing, and that's where the tussock land, if you like, is cured. So the frost actually sucks the moisture out of the fuels. You know what I mean? And then there's sort of that, and then Ohau is wind-driven type fire. Very strong winds. Like up to 160 k's. So wind-driven type fire through those types of fuels. Yeah. So there's not just one thing. There's a couple of variables in that space.
For our listeners and viewers that are traditionally, of course, rurally based, we make that assumption here in Zero's Country. Graeme, is there more that we can be doing to be on edge, so to speak, around our farming practices at different times of year that can sort of prevent a lot more fires?
Generally, farmers are really sharp, like they sort of know what everyone knows what they're doing, and generally they are, they're pretty clever on how they manage their land, and fire is just another land management tool as opposed to whatever other activity we might carry out for land management. But the trick is that, from my experience, and I do a bit of burning myself, don't mind clearing a bit of land but using fire because it is a useful tool. But the trick is to identify when you can and when you can't, and not pressurize yourself that we must do it, right? Because there's always another time. So it's having a 12-month plan, and if things aren't quite measuring up on a particular day or a particular week, just leave it for another particular day or another particular week. Don't think, I've got to get this done because that's my window. I won't have time next week or the week after. So we just have to be in that space where it's not always a good time to burn. And this year, to be fair, a lot of the high country sort of November really, before we started getting a change in that weather pattern with a bit of rain and stuff that helped everyone out. To be fair, this year in the high country, it was one of the probably worst seasons we've had for about 4 or 5 years for burning in the high country because of the conditions weren't right. You know what I mean? So some of the burns were quite tricky, to be fair. And, if you've got a long-term plan, you can always do another block, or you know what I mean? So it's identifying the fire season and the fire danger level, and maybe look at it for another time.
It's interesting that you say that. I was just thinking about, the reduction in freedom campers. And I mean, we saw a very dumb act of a campfire up near Middlehurst in the Muzzle, actually, in the Archery Valley. And that was from people lighting campfires. And I sort of thought we would have, Kiwis ourselves as domestic tourists being a bit smarter than that.
We've seen an increase in New Zealand freedom campers this year, because we can't travel anywhere else. So we've seen a large increase in that, and that was a concern leading up and over the holiday period, because we just weren't sure how people would cope around freedom camping, around cooking, and around trying to keep warm. But generally, it's been pretty good, I have to say. There's a lot of information out there, but it's not rocket science, is it? Like if we've got a 30-degree day and it's windy, well, let's use our brains, Yeah. But what we're finding is that most of the unwanted campfires, if you like, are ones that haven't been extinguished properly, and they flare up the next day. People aren't generally people light fires on the day, and they're not necessarily the ones that are catching us out. It's when they don't put them out, and it's the next day or the day after we get a fire that rekindles. And those are the ones that so when we have it, if and when, and we follow the rules, because not every area you can have a fire, you need to find out first and foremost whether there's any restrictions in place around those fires. And if you are allowed, you've got to make sure you put them out. And that's not just tipping a bit of water on them, that's putting your hand on the ash and what we call cold trailing. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Graeme, and all your involvement over the decades and dedication to this. And of course, as you said, you do have a passion for understanding the science of fires, and really appreciate your time as a newsmaker in this week's Farmers Weekly. Graeme Still there from Fire and Emergency, a wildfire specialist.